The rain fell in sheets over the kingdom of Vaelthorn. It had been raining for 3 days straight, the kind of rain that soaked through stone walls and settled into bones, that turned the cobblestone paths into rivers of gray water, and made the torches along the castle parapets hiss and sputter against the dark. Most of the court had retreated indoors, drawn to the warmth of fireplaces and mulled wine and the comfort of closed doors. The great hall blazed with light and music, and the kind of laughter that only existed when someone important was being celebrated. Zara Voss stood outside in all of it. She didn't feel the cold. Not really. Not with the small paper strip clutched between her trembling fingers, its 2 thin pink lines blurring every time she blinked rain from her lashes. She'd read it 4 times in the dim light of her private chambers. 4 times, as if the answer might change, as if the universe might take pity on her and let the lines fade back to 1. They hadn't. She stood at the base of the great hall's entrance, the massive oak doors carved with the crest of House Vaelthorn, twin serpents coiling around a crown, and she breathed, in through her nose, out through her mouth. The scent of pine was everywhere up here, sharp and ancient, drifting down from the forbidden woods that pressed against the northern edge of the castle grounds like a dark secret. She'd always loved that smell. It had felt safe once. Alaric will know what to do. The thought arrived soft and sure, the way all of her thoughts about him did. And she had loved Alaric Vaelthorn with the kind of love that didn't announce itself, quiet, deep, the sort that settled into the marrow without warning. For 8 months she had been his, not officially, never officially, but he had called her his solace, his sanctuary. He had pressed his lips to her temple in the dark and told her she was the only warmth left in a world that had gone cold for him centuries ago. She had believed him. Her fingers curled around the pregnancy test. She believed him still. Zara pushed open the doors. The warmth hit her first, a wave of candlelight and perfumed air, and the collective body heat of 400 gathered courtiers. The music was something sweeping and orchestral, strings climbing toward a crescendo, and the great chandelier overhead blazed with 1,000 candles that turned the entire hall to gold. She stepped inside, rain dripping from the ends of her dark hair, her gown immediately beginning to cling to her skin, and for a single suspended moment she simply stood at the threshold and looked at the scene before her. It took her too long to understand what she was seeing. The dais at the far end of the hall had been draped in deep crimson and silver. Fresh flowers, night bloom roses, Vaelthorn's ceremonial flower, lined every surface, their scent cloying and sweet beneath the smoke of the candles. The court stood in perfect formation on either side of a long central aisle, their finest clothes a blur of jewel tones and pressed collars, their faces turned toward the front of the room with expressions of collective, unreverent attention. And at the top of the dais stood Alaric. He was, as he always was, devastating to look at. Tall and carved from something colder than marble, with cheekbones that could cut glass and eyes the precise color of a winter sky at dusk, that pale, frozen gray that looked almost silver in certain light. He wore his formal blacks, the high collar of his coat framing a face that had stopped the hearts of empires. His dark hair was swept back. His posture was imperial, absolute. He was placing a crown on another woman's head. Zara's feet stopped moving. The crown was delicate, an intricate thing of white gold and moonstone, the consort's crown, a piece she had seen only once before in the Vaelthorn archives. She had read about it in passing, had never let herself imagine it resting on her own head, had never been so foolish as to want something so official, so permanent. But she had never imagined watching it settle onto her head. Onto Seraphine Crestwood, who stood beneath Alaric's hands like she had been built for exactly this moment, tall and pale and regal, her white gown untouched by weather or doubt, her golden hair piled high beneath the descending crown. She was smiling, the smile of someone who had always known this was coming. The hall erupted. Applause, cheering. The stamping of feet on stone floors and the ringing of crystal goblets struck together in toast. The orchestra surged into something triumphant. 400 voices rose in celebration of a future queen, while Zara stood at the back of the room, soaking wet and holding a pregnancy test, and felt the world she had built around herself begin to crack. She registered the looks. Surprise. She registered the looks. Surprise. Confusion. A sharp cruelty on some faces she had always suspected harbored it. She didn't stop. She needed to reach him. She needed him to see her face and remember everything he'd said in the dark, and she needed him to... Alaric. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Still, he heard it. Vampire hearing, sharp as a blade across every distance. His head turned. The hall quieted. Not completely, but enough. Enough that the silence that fell between them had weight and witnesses. Alaric Vaelthorn looked at Zara Voss with his silver eyes, and something in those eyes made her take an involuntary step backward. There was no recognition in them, no warmth, no flash of the man who had whispered her name against her hair and told her she was the only thing in 3 centuries that had made him feel something. There was nothing. Worse than nothing. There was amusement. Ah. His voice carried without effort, smooth and cold as a stone pulled from a winter river. Lady Voss. The title landed like a slap. Not her name. Not Zara. Lady Voss. The formal distance of it, the deliberate reduction of everything they had been to a simple courtesy title. I wasn't expecting you. He tilted his head, and the gesture was almost lazy, the way a cat might regard a bird that had flown into the wrong room. Though I suppose it's fitting you're here. Every celebration should have its context. He glanced at the court, a ghost of a smile at his perfect mouth. Lady Voss served a particular purpose these past months, a palate cleanser, shall we say. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd before the true queen arrived. The laughter that followed was not kind. Zara's hand clenched around the strip of paper in her fingers so hard the edges cut into her palm. She could feel the eyes of the court on her like physical pressure. She could feel the heat in her face despite the cold water still dripping from her hair. She could feel something tearing inside her chest, slowly, methodically, the way old fabric gives when pulled from opposite ends. She took one step toward the dais. Just one. Alaric. Her voice was low this time, private, meant only for him. I need to speak with you. There's something you need to know. Something... She opened her fingers slightly, letting him see the edge of the paper strip. Something that changes things. He was beside her before she finished the sentence. That was the thing about vampires that the court always forgot to be afraid of. The speed. One moment Alaric was on the dais, 3 feet of elevation and 30 feet of distance between them. The next, he was simply there, his hand at her throat, not gripping, not yet, just resting with a terrible, deliberate precision. His fingers were cold. They were always cold. She had once found comfort in that cold. His lips were at her ear. If you breathe one word of whatever you think you're about to say... His voice was a whisper so precise it carved itself into her like a blade. I will have you named a traitor before morning. You know what we do to traitors in Vaelthorn, Zara. The use of her name now, quiet, weaponized, stripped of everything it had once held between them. The hunt is very thorough, very final. He stepped back, smiled at the court. Lady Voss was just leaving. He turned away from her as completely as one turns away from something beneath notice. Continue. The music resumed. She ran. There was no dignity in it, and she didn't care. She turned and she walked, and then she was through the doors, and the cold hit her again like a punishment, and then she was running, down the stone steps, across the courtyard, past the guard towers where the sentries deliberately looked away. Her heels caught on wet cobblestone, and she lost one and kept going, one shoe on and one bare foot slapping against rain-slicked ground, her breath coming in hard, ragged pulls that didn't feel like enough air. The pregnancy test was still in her hand. and castle grounds blurred into wild grass, and castle grounds blurred into wild grass and then into the tree line. The pine smell hit her like a wall, thick and overwhelming, the scent of resin and wet bark and something darker beneath it, something ancient. The forbidden woods. She didn't stop at the tree line the way every instinct and every lesson of her childhood told her to. She plunged in. The trees swallowed the torchlight from the castle immediately. The canopy overhead was dense even in the rain, filtering it to a fine mist, and she could hear the water dripping from needled branches in the sudden relative quiet. Her one remaining heel caught on a root, and she wrenched it off, threw it aside, ran in bare feet over pine needles and cold mud and the occasional sharp bite of a hidden stone. Behind her, distant still but growing, she heard them. The howling began low. A single voice, then two, then a cascading chorus of sound that turned her blood to ice water. Vampire wolves. Alaric's hunting pack, the ones he kept in the East Kennels and set loose on deserters, on spies, on anyone foolish enough to try to run from Vaelthorn. She had heard stories. She had never been foolish enough to require the reality of them. Until tonight. She ran harder. The trees blurred past her. A branch caught her cheek and drew a thin line of fire across her skin. The mud tried to grab at her feet with every step. The rain, thicker now even through the canopy, plastered her hair to her face and made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. The forest had no landmarks she recognized. She had never been this far in. No one came into the forbidden woods, not the servants, not the guards, not the most reckless of the court's younger lords who treated danger like a game. There were reasons for that. She didn't let herself think about the reasons. The howling was closer, close enough now that she could hear the individual voices separating, one to her left, circling, one directly behind her, closing the distance with steady, patient confidence. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They knew these woods. They were hunting, not chasing. There was a difference, and the difference was that a hunt ended only one way. Her lungs were burning. Her feet were bleeding. She could feel the warm slide of it against the cold mud with every step. She pressed the hand with the pregnancy test against her chest as she ran, some primitive impulse to protect the evidence of the thing she had not yet decided how to carry. The trees thinned. Abruptly, terrifyingly, the trees simply stopped. She hit the cliff edge with 3 feet to spare, skidding in the mud, her arms pinwheeling for balance as the ground ended and the world dropped away before her. She caught herself, stood at the precipice, looked down. Below was darkness and the sound of water, a river, far down, invisible in the mist. How far was the drop? 60 feet? 100? The mist that rolled up from the gorge was cold against her face, carrying the smell of mineral-rich water and green things and the deep, untouched chill of something the sun rarely reached. Behind her, the howling stopped. The silence was worse. She could hear them now in the brush, the soft displacement of undergrowth, the careful placement of heavy paws. They were close. They were surrounding the clearing at the cliff's edge, methodical and patient. She turned slowly and counted shadows in the tree line. 3, 4. 5 pairs of luminescent eyes blinking in the darkness between the pines, low and predatory, watching her with the cold intelligence that separated Alaric's wolves from ordinary animals. Zara stood at the edge of the cliff with nowhere left to run and a pregnancy test pressed against her heart and looked at the thing her life had become in the space of 20 minutes. She did not cry. There was something beyond crying now, something quieter and more fundamental. The wolves at the tree line shifted, and then, from the mist that rose from the gorge behind her, from the darkness to the left of the clearing where the cliff curved, 2 shadows emerged. They were enormous. Not wolves, not vampires, something else entirely, moving with a weight and presence that made the hunting pack at the tree line go instantly, completely still. One of Alaric's wolves made a sound she had never heard from them before, something small and involuntary, something that in a lesser creature she might have called a whimper. The shadows solidified. 2 figures, massive. The mist curled around them like it recognized them, like the forbidden woods itself made room for what they were. Their eyes caught what little light existed in the clearing and held it. Not the cold silver of vampires, not the luminescent animal gleam of the hunting pack. Something older than both. Something gold. Zara stared. The cliff edge was at her heels. The pack was frozen at the tree line. The rain fell between her and the two impossible figures who had stepped out of the mist as if they had always been there, waiting, as if this moment had always been the destination. The larger of the two figures turned their gaze from the wolves to her. For the first time since she had walked through the doors of the great hall tonight, Zara felt something other than fear. She couldn't name it yet, but it felt, strangely and terrifyingly, like the beginning of something. The larger figure stepped forward first. The mist parted around him like it had been waiting for permission, rolling back in slow curls to reveal the full shape of what Zara was looking at. Her mind struggled to process it, the way it always did when reality refused to stay inside the boundaries she'd built for it. She had grown up in Vaelthorn's court. She had shared a castle with vampires for 3 years. She thought she had developed a reasonable tolerance for things that defied the ordinary. She had not. He was tall in the way that mountains were tall. Not just a measurement, but a presence, something that reorganized the space around it simply by existing. Well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulder in a way that made the trees behind him look like appropriate scale rather than background. His hair was dark and rain-damp, pushed back from a face that was severe and angular and marked. She could see even in the dim clearing light, by a scar that ran from the edge of his left eyebrow down across his cheekbone to the corner of his jaw. An old scar, the kind that had been given with intention. He wore no armor, only dark-layered clothing that moved easily with him, and his hands, large, scarred at the knuckles, hung loose at his sides in the particular stillness of something that had nothing left to prove. His eyes were gold, not amber, not hazel. Gold, the warm, burning, impossible gold of a flame held behind glass, with a darkness at the center that went very deep and gave nothing back. He looked at the wolves at the tree line and said nothing. The wolves looked back at him and made that sound again, that small, involuntary, eye-humiliating sound, and then the nearest one took a step backward into the brush. The second figure moved up alongside the first, and where the first was stillness and severity, the second was something else entirely. Same height, similarly built, but where the first carried himself like a closed door, this one was an open window. Something in the set of his mouth, a quality of attention in his own gold eyes that was different in character. Sharper, more curious. He was scanning the clearing the way someone reads a room they've already decided to enjoy, and when his gaze moved from the wolves to Zara, it stayed there with an interest that was almost conversational. He had a cut along his jaw, fresh and unbothered. Rain had flattened his dark hair against his forehead. He looked, improbably, looked at the wolves, and the wolves, looked at the wolves and the wolves. Alaric Vaelthorn's wolves, the pack that had reduced veteran soldiers to terror with nothing but their howls, turned and disappeared into the forbidden woods without another sound, not retreating, fleeing. Zara stood at the cliff edge and breathed. "You can step away from the edge." The voice belonged to the severe one. It was low and unhurried, carrying the particular quality of someone who rarely spoke, and therefore expected to be heard when they did. No warmth in it, no threat either, just a statement, delivered with the same energy as a weather observation. Zara looked down and realized she had pressed herself so close to the cliff's edge in the last 60 seconds that her heels were literally suspended over open air. She took 3 fast steps forward onto solid ground and hated herself for how her legs shook when she did. There. The other one, the one with the almost smile, tilted his head. Better. "Who are you?" Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. 3 years at Vaelthorn's court had given her that much, at least. The ability to sound composed when composure was entirely cosmetic. "Silas." The almost smile one indicated himself, then gestured toward his companion. "Kael." A brief pause. "And you're bleeding." She looked down. Her feet, bare, muddy, run raw over pine needles and hidden stones, were indeed bleeding. Multiple small cuts across both soles, and one deeper gash on her right heel that had left a trail behind her she hadn't noticed in the dark. She stared at them for a moment with the faint dissociation of someone who had recently exceeded their capacity for new information. "I ran through the woods," she said, as if this required explanation. "We know." Kael, the scarred one, the silent one, was looking at the tree line rather than at her. Assessing. Still doing the perpetual threat calculation, she could see running behind those gold eyes even from a distance. Alaric's pack has been circling this section of the border for 3 nights. Something in the way he said Alaric's name, flat and precise, the way one says the name of a thing they have studied and found unremarkable, made Zara look at him more carefully. "You know him. We know of him." Silas's tone was lighter, easier, but his eyes, still resting on her with that quality of attentive curiosity, had not changed. The way one knows of a storm system, you track it, you prepare for it, you don't respect it. A howl sounded from deep in the woods, distant now, retreating, but audible. Kael moved first. "We need to go." "Go where?" Zara heard her own voice sharpen. The adrenaline was still metabolizing, converting itself into something more combative. She was standing in the forbidden woods at the edge of a cliff in the rain, with 2 strangers whose eyes burned gold and whose presence had just scattered a vampire hunting pack like startled birds. And she had a pregnancy test in her hand, and blood on her feet, and the echo of Alaric's voice still cutting grooves in the inside of her skull. She was not, she decided, going anywhere without more information. "I don't know you, either of you." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kael. Kael looked at the woods. "You're right," Silas said, turning back to her. "You don't, and we don't know you." He held out one hand, open-palmed, not reaching, not demanding, simply offering. "But you're bleeding in the forbidden woods in the middle of the night with Vaelthorn's hunters behind you. And we have a fortress 20 minutes north with walls they won't cross." He tilted his head slightly. "You can stay here and make a principled stand about stranger danger, or you can come with us and have that seen to." A brief glance at her feet. "Your choice." Zara looked at his open hand, looked at the darkness behind her where the wolves had gone. I did not take his hand, but she did not take his hand, but she stepped forward, and that was enough. The obsidian fortress appeared through the trees the way things appeared in old stories, suddenly and completely, as if it had always been there and the forest had simply been keeping it. It rose from a natural elevation in the landscape, black stone against a black sky, its towers blunt and unapologetic, its walls thick in the way of something built for function rather than aesthetics. No decorative battlements, no ornamental carvings, just stone and scale and the faint amber glow of firelight showing in the arrow-slit windows like eyes behind a closed face. It was nothing like Vaelthorn Castle. Vaelthorn was all Gothic excess. Vaulted ceilings and serpent crests and the kind of beauty that reminded you it could hurt you. This place made no aesthetic argument whatsoever. It simply was. Immovable. Final. Zara found it, to her own confusion, more comforting. Inside, the fortress was warmer than it had any right to be. The stone walls absorbed the heat from fireplaces built in every main room. She counted 3 in the entrance hall alone, each one large enough to stand in, burning what smelled like pine and cedar and something earthier she couldn't name. The floors were dark stone covered with heavy woven rugs in deep reds and browns. The ceilings were high but not vaulted, supported by timber beams rather than carved arches. Functional, solid. A woman who introduced herself only as Marin, older, gray-haired, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has worked for dangerous people long enough to stop being impressed by them, appeared from a side corridor and ushered Zara to a chair by the closest fire before either king could speak. She produced a basin of warm water and a medical kit with the air of someone who had been anticipating injury since before it happened. Zara sat. Kael disappeared. Silas settled into a chair on the opposite side of the fireplace with the particular ease of someone who was going to stay whether invited or not, stretched one leg out, and watched Maren work on Zara's feet with the patient attention of someone with nowhere better to be. "You're from Vaelthorn Court," he said. Not a question. "Was." The word came out before she decided to say it. "Was," he repeated. Something in his tone acknowledged the distinction without pressing it. "The gown is court issue. The embroidery on the hem is Vaelthorn's secondary house pattern." His gold eyes moved briefly to the ruined fabric. "You were at a formal event tonight." Zara looked at him steadily. "Do you catalog everyone who ends up at your cliff?" "Only the interesting ones." The almost smile again. It did something complicated to the architecture of his face, not softening it exactly, but shifting it, revealing that the sharpness was chosen rather than fixed. "How long were you at court?" 3 years. "Under Alaric?" "Yes." A brief silence. Maren wrapped the worst of the cuts on Zara's right heel with practiced efficiency. The fire popped. Outside, the rain had intensified again, drumming against the fortress walls with the muffled persistence of something that had accepted it wasn't getting in. "And tonight he sent his pack after you," Silas said. It wasn't a question either. She was starting to understand that most of what he said wasn't. "Yes." She kept her voice even. "Gave him nothing else." 3 years at court had also taught her the particular skill of answering questions with their minimum viable content. He tilted his head, studied her in a way that was assessing without being unkind, the way someone reads a text in a language they know well and finds themselves curious about one particular word. "He'll regret that," he said finally simply, and went back to watching the fire. Kael returned an hour later. He appeared in the doorway of what Maren had identified as the west sitting room, where Zara had been installed after her feet were dressed, given dry clothing that was clearly not tailored for her, and left with a cup of something hot and herbed that tasted like pine and honey and made the shaking in her hands slowly subside. He stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through spaces, as if entering a room was a tactical decision requiring brief assessment before commitment. His gold eyes went to her immediately, then something shifted in them. It was subtle, a fractional change in the quality of his attention. He was still looking at her, but he was also, she had the distinct and strange sense, registering her. The way you register a sound that you've never heard before and can't immediately classify. His nostrils moved, the barest flicker. He crossed the room without speaking and settled into a chair adjacent to the fireplace at the farthest point of the grouping from where she sat, put his elbows on his knees, looked at the fire, said nothing. Silas appeared in the doorway behind him, took in the arrangement, and met Zara's eyes with an expression that managed to communicate both yes, he's always like this and don't take it personally without any words at all. He came in and sat closer, refilled her cup from the pot on the hearth without asking. "Sleep," Kael said, still looking at the fire. His voice, up close and not competing with rain and wind, was even lower than it had seemed at the cliff. It resonated somewhere in the chest. "I'm not tired," Zara said. A long pause. "You're exhausted," he said. "You're just not ready to stop yet." Another pause. "There's a difference." She stared at the side of his face, the severe profile, the scar mapping its history down his cheekbone, the set of his jaw with something that wanted to be called gentleness, but was too unused to quite arrive at it. He wasn't looking at her. He had said the thing with the same flat certainty he seemed to apply to all facts, as if the interior states of people who had just run through the forbidden woods were simply observable phenomena, like weather. She wanted to argue with him. She couldn't, because he was right. What they felt, they couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't experienced it. Kael became aware of it first. In the precise and orderly way he became aware of most things, as a fact that required cataloging. He was sitting in the chair looking at the fire and tracking the scent patterns in the room the way he always did, ambient and automatic, when something shifted in the layered air of the sitting room and became specific, became hers, and the specificity of it was unlike anything he had processed before. It moved through his awareness not like information, but like recognition. The way a word in your native language sounds different in the middle of a sentence full of foreign ones. He did not look at her. Looking at her would have been an acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required him to know what he was acknowledging, and he didn't, not yet. He filed it, held it at distance. Applied the same methodical containment he applied to everything that threatened to be larger than he knew how to manage. Silas felt it differently, as a warmth that arrived without announcement, the way good news does, settling into the chest and asking to be examined. He had been watching her since the cliff, cataloging her with the particular attention he gave to things he found genuinely surprising, and somewhere in the hour since they'd returned to the fortress, the quality of that attention had changed without his permission. He was still watching her. But now, there was something underneath the observation that had nothing to do with analysis. Both of them had heard the old stories. Every hybrid did. The true mate bond was not myth. They'd seen it in others, had spent years being quietly, unpragmatically resigned to the statistical improbability of their own. They were kings of the forbidden border. Their lives were catalogued and controlled. They didn't believe in cosmic interference. They both, independently and without speaking, became less certain of that position over the course of a single evening. Neither of them knew, could not have known, that what they were responding to was not destiny arriving on schedule, that the change in her scent was not a bond blooming, but a life beginning, that the warmth they were reading as recognition was something older and more complicated, carrying the genetic signature of the one enemy they had promised each other across decades and scarred landscapes to destroy. They sat on opposite sides of the fireplace from Zara Voss and felt something they had no accurate name for, and said nothing, and let the fire burn. Zara knew she should tell them. She sat with the dry clothes wrapped around her and the heat of the fire finally beginning to reach the cold that had settled into her since the rain, and she turned the fact of it over and over in her mind, the way you turn a stone that's too heavy to put down and too uncomfortable to hold. She was carrying a child. She was carrying Alaric Vaelthorn's child. She was sitting in the fortress of two men who had driven Alaric's hunters away with nothing but their presence, who looked at her with gold eyes that made her feel, against every rational protest she could assemble, seen. Not assessed. Not evaluated for her court value, or her bloodline, or her political utility. Seen. She looked at Kael's scarred profile, and in the rigid architecture of a face that had learned to keep its doors closed, and thought about the way his voice had sounded when he said, "You're just not ready to stop yet." Like he had recognized something in her that she hadn't even named for herself. She looked at Silas, who was looking at the fire now, one hand loose around his cup, and found him already looking back. The gold of his eyes caught the firelight and held it, and the almost smile was gone. What was there instead was quieter and more serious and somehow more alarming. She looked away first. "I have to tell them." She pressed her hand against her stomach, barely a pressure, more instinct than intention. "I can't tell them. Not yet. Not tonight." Tonight she had run through the woods in the rain and lost a life she had built for 3 years in the span of a door swinging open. And she was sitting in a fortress that smelled of pine and cedar and fire, and 2 impossible men were looking at her like she was something they had been waiting to find. And she was a fraud. She was sitting in the warmth of something she didn't deserve to receive, carrying the evidence of her own devastating misjudgment pressed against her heart. She was terrified. She was, underneath the terror, something else. She didn't look at it directly. Looking at it directly would have required more courage than she had left for one night. But she felt it. quiet and treacherous and completely unwelcome, the way you feel the first morning of spring, even when you're not ready for winter to be over. The fire crackled. Outside, Vaelthorn's woods pressed against the fortress walls and kept their secrets, and Zara Voss closed her eyes, and didn't sleep, and waited to find out what happened next. The moon-lilies appeared on the third morning. Zara found them when she opened the door of her assigned chamber, a room on the fortress's eastern corridor that was spare and solid and smelled permanently of cedar, with a window that looked out over the tree line and let in the first light of dawn before anywhere else in the building caught it. She had begun waking early, which was new, or rather, she had begun waking in the pre-dawn hours with her stomach staging quiet, insistent rebellions against her, which required her to sit very still at the edge of the bed and breathe through her nose until the worst of it passed, after which sleep was generally not an option. She was calling it exhaustion. It was the only available category. The lilies were on the floor outside her door, a full arrangement, 7 stems, their petals the blue-white of a clear winter moon, luminescent in a way that had nothing to do with the dim corridor lighting. Moon lilies didn't grow in the forbidden woods. They grew at elevation, on north-facing cliff faces where ordinary plants refused to commit. They bloomed for approximately 3 days per lunar cycle, and then closed back into themselves for another month. There was no note. Zara stood in her doorway in borrowed clothes and looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked down the corridor in both directions. Empty. She picked them up, brought them inside, set them on the windowsill where the early light hit them and turned their petals to something that looked almost like trapped moonlight. She stood there looking at them for longer than she meant to. Silas found her in the training yard before breakfast, but she hadn't gone there with any intention. She'd simply been walking the fortress perimeter because walking helped, in the mornings, helped her body settle into itself and stop protesting the fact of its own continued existence. The training yard was at the fortress's southern edge, open to the sky, its packed earth floor marked with the systematic wear patterns of long habitual use. Weapons racks lined the eastern wall, an assortment that suggested 2 people with different preferences, longer blades at one end, shorter and more numerous toward the other. Silas was already there, no shirt, a practice sword in his right hand, moving through a sequence she didn't recognize, not any of the formal Vaelthorn court styles she'd been cursorily taught, something lower and more economical, designed for a different kind of fight. He moved through it with the fluid repetition of something practiced so many thousands of times it had passed through conscious thought and become something closer to breathing. He stopped when he heard her, turned, took in the fact of her presence with the particular gold-eyed attention that she was learning was his default state when she was in his vicinity. His skin in the morning light was darker than she'd fully registered in the firelit fortress interior, and the fresh training had put a brightness in his eyes that made the gold of them deeper somehow, more present. "Good morning," he said, which was the kind of greeting that sounded neutral and managed through his particular inflection to be something more interested than that. "Good morning," she said back, kept her voice even, looked at the practice sword in his hand. "What style is that?" He looked down at the blade as if mildly surprised to find himself holding it. "Borderland form. Developed for fighting in close terrain, forest, ruins, anywhere you can't guarantee open ground." He flipped it once in his hand, easy and thoughtless, and then held it out to her. "Wanna see?" She should have said no. She didn't have the energy for it, not really, and her right foot still pulled slightly where the heel had been cut, and her stomach had only settled to its current tolerable neutrality an hour ago. She should have eaten something and gone back to her room. She took the practice sword. His hands corrected her grip before she'd finished forming it, not taking the blade from her, just adjusting her fingers one by one with a patience that had nothing hurried in it. His hands were warm. Warmer than she'd expected, warmer than the morning air, and larger than they looked when he wasn't holding something, and he was close enough that she could smell the particular warm cedar and metal scent of him, which she had begun in the past 3 days to recognize with an unconscious accuracy that she didn't examine too closely. "Don't death grip it," he said. His voice was close, not intimate, instructional, but close. You're not trying to strangle it. It's an extension, like pointing. Like pointing, she repeated. Like pointing. A pause. Try the first position. She tried. He watched with the focused patience of someone who is genuinely interested in a problem, which was, she was discovering, how Silas Vael approached most things. Not with the performative attention of Vaelthorn's courtiers who listened only long enough to plan their response, but with an actual quality of presence that landed on whatever it was aimed at and stayed. It was, she thought, in some ways the most dangerous thing about him. She worked through 20 minutes of the basic form and was terrible at it in the specific way of someone who is athletic but unschooled, and he corrected her without commentary beyond the corrections, and occasionally said there in a tone that made the small victories feel earned rather than condescended to. She was enjoying herself. She noticed this with some suspicion. Kael was at breakfast. He was always at breakfast. In the main hall, a cup of something dark in the main hall, a cup of something dark in front of him, and when she came in from the training yard, he looked up from the map he'd been studying, and his gold eyes moved over her. The flushed face, the borrowed training clothes, the practice sword callus already forming on her palm, and something moved briefly through his expression before it closed again. Silas. Not a question. He was already in the yard, she said, neutral, sitting 2 chairs down and reaching for the bread. Kael looked at the map, said nothing, turned a page. That afternoon she found a new pair of boots outside her door. Her size, exactly. Dark leather, soft-soled, practical. The kind you could run in, the kind that would not leave her barefoot in the woods again, still no note. She stood in the corridor and looked at them and felt something warm and unwelcome turn over in her chest. When she came downstairs in them, Kael was at the far end of the entrance hall reviewing supply inventories with Maren. He didn't look up when she entered, but Maren's eyes tracked to the boots immediately, and something in the old woman's expression settled into the particular quiet satisfaction of someone watching a trajectory they'd already predicted. That evening, Silas appeared at dinner with moon-lily pollen on the back of his hand. He noticed her noticing. The almost smile arrived and departed in the same second. He said nothing. She said nothing. Across the table, Kael's eyes moved between them with an attention that was very still and very thorough, and then he refilled her water cup without being asked, precisely and without comment, and went back to his dinner. The fever between them, all 3 of them, this triangulated warmth that none of them had named and none of them were addressing, climbed another degree and settled there, burning steady. By the 6th day, the morning sickness had developed opinions. It was no longer content with the pre-dawn hours. It arrived now at irregular intervals, a sudden insistent nausea that had no reliable schedule and no consistent trigger, appearing sometimes after meals and sometimes in the middle of the afternoon training sessions Silas had made a quiet daily habit of, and twice now in the middle of conversations that required her to excuse herself with the explanation of the altitude, I think, which she could tell neither of them fully believed. She was drinking the herbed tea Maren provided every morning with an increasing urgency. Maren had not asked questions. Maren's lack of questions had, by day 4, become a specific and meaningful silence, the kind that contained knowledge, that communicated, I know what I know, and I'm waiting to see what you do with it. Zara looked at her over the teacup every morning and said nothing, and Maren looked back with gray eyes that saw too clearly, and the silence between them held. The fainting spell happened during the 7th afternoon's training session. It wasn't dramatic. That was, in retrospect, almost worse. Silas had been walking her through defensive positioning, where to move your weight, how to use the momentum of a larger opponent against them, and she had been standing in the particular posture he demonstrated, shifting her stance to match his instruction, and then the world had simply tilted. A gray wash across her vision, her knees making a decision her brain hadn't ratified. She went down in stages rather than all at once, which gave him enough warning to be there. He caught her, both hands, one at her back and one at her arm, pulling her up before her knees fully met the ground. Up close, holding her weight, his face was nearer to her than it had been since the cliff, and the gold of his eyes had gone very sharp and very focused and entirely serious, the almost smile completely absent. "Zara." His voice was different, and stripped of the light tone he usually carried, direct in a way that asked for reciprocal honesty. "What's happening?" "Low blood sugar," she said immediately. "I didn't eat enough this morning. It happens." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. 4. The kind of look that reads a face the way you read a text you suspect has been edited. "You've been eating," he said. "Not enough, apparently." She straightened, didn't pull away from his hands. She didn't have the physical steadiness to be principled about it right now, but shifted her weight back to her own feet. "I'm fine." Another long beat. "We stop for today," he said, and it wasn't a negotiation. She didn't argue. Arguing would have required energy she was routing elsewhere. It happened the following evening. She didn't know how it started. So precisely. It had grown out of a quiet moment in the west sitting room, the fire going, the rain returning with its habitual persistence, Silas reading at one end of the room while she rested at the other, Kael somewhere in the fortress doing the systematic security checks he performed every evening without fail. It had been, by the standards of the past week, almost peaceful. She had been nearly asleep. "Your heart rate is elevated," Silas said without looking up from his book. She opened her eyes. "I wasn't aware you were monitoring it." "I'm not. I can simply hear it." He turned a page. "You don't need to be afraid here. Alaric's pack hasn't—" "I'm not afraid," she said. True, mostly. What she was right now was profoundly tired and queasy and full of a secret that had grown in the past week from a difficult fact into something heavier, something with weight and gravity, pulling at her from the inside. He set the book down, looked at her fully now. The firelight made the gold of his eyes very warm, and his face in this light, in the absence of the almost smile, in genuine attention, was a different kind of arresting than she'd registered before, serious and careful, interested in her specifically, as a specific person. He crossed the room. Not quickly. Every movement he made was declared. He sat on the low table between their chairs, which put him close, and looked at her for a moment and then said, "May I?" She didn't know what he was asking. She didn't say no. He placed one hand against the side of her ribcage, pulled it inward, toward whatever his pulled it inward, toward whatever his hybrid hearing was processing. His focus sharpened. His brow moved, fractionally, the kind of micro-expression that crosses a face before it can be curated. He was very still. He heard it. She saw him hear it, watched the information arrive in his expression, the confusion first, because it didn't map to anything categorized, because it was a rhythm inside a rhythm, a second-time signature laid over the first. She watched him begin to reach for what it meant, the gold of his eyes going distant with the effort of processing. The alarm hit the fortress like a wall, a deep, a resonant sound from the outer perimeter, not the howl of wolves, something more mechanical and therefore somehow more alarming, the warning system the fortress ran along its northern boundary. Both of them were on their feet before it finished its first note. Silas's hand left her side. His face closed, immediately and completely, all the careful private attention gone, replaced with the same operational focus she'd seen on the cliff. "Stay here," he said. He was out of the room before she could answer. Zara stood in the firelight, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, and breathed. He was close. The thought arrived cold and clear. He was close and the alarm stopped it. She had perhaps a day, maybe less. The envoy arrived at the fortress gates at midday. 3 of them, mounted on pale horses, now wearing Vaelthorn's colors, deep purple and silver, with the twin serpent crest embroidered on their riding coats. The man at the front was Chancellor Veth, whom Zara recognized immediately from the court. Thin, precise, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to make themselves useful to dangerous people and had built a personality from that skill upward. He had small eyes and a careful mouth, and had once told Zara, pleasantly, that her presence at court was a privilege that ought not be taken for granted. She stood at the second-floor window and watched them arrive and felt her stomach drop entirely below the reach of the morning sickness. He found me in 8 days. She heard Kael's voice from the entrance below. Low, even. The sound of someone who has decided in advance how a conversation will go and is now simply conducting it to its predetermined conclusion. Then Silas, from closer, and the particular quality of his tone, still light, still almost conversational, but carrying underneath it a harmonic that had no warmth in it at all. She was downstairs in 3 minutes. She came into the entrance hall to find both kings facing the 3 envoys across the open space. Kael stood slightly forward, his hands loose at his from him in 8 days, which, given what from him in 8 days, which, given what she had learned of his range, was exactly as alarming as it was designed to be. Chancellor Veth saw her enter. "They've been most concerned for your welfare. They've been most concerned for your welfare. The circumstances of your departure were—" A delicate pause. "Alarming for all involved. He wishes for your safe return." "His property," Kael said. Veth blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Those were the words in the formal communication. Kael's voice was absolutely level. "His property, you used property." A pause that had teeth in it. "She has a name." A brief silence. Veth recalibrated. "Of course, His Majesty wishes—" "His Majesty's wishes," Silas said pleasantly, "are not our particular concern. Lady Voss is a citizen of Vaelthorn. She is subject to— She's standing in Vael territory." Kael's voice didn't raise. It never needed to. She came here of her own will, and she remains of her own will. Vaelthorn's jurisdiction ends at the border. You know where the border is. Zara had moved without deciding to, crossed the entrance hall until she was standing beside them, not behind them, positioned at the edge of the space between the Vael kings and the Vaelthorn envoy. She could feel both Kael and Silas register her presence the way they always registered her. That particular quality of heightened awareness that she'd stopped trying to explain to herself. Veth's small eyes moved to her. "Lady Voss, surely you understand that returning to Vaelthorn is in your best—" "She's not returning." Silas's voice had lost its pleasantness. What was underneath was something with no warmth in it at all. Calm the way a deep body of water is calm. Back to Alaric there's no ambiguity. She back to Alaric there's no ambiguity. She is ours. She is under our protection, our roof, and our claim. He looked at Veth with the gold eyes that had stopped a vampire hunting pack with a glance. "Write that down if it helps." Kael turned his head and looked at Zara. Not the way he looked at a threat. Not the assessing strategic gaze he applied to everything that required management. He looked at her the way he'd looked when he'd heard her scent in the sitting room, that quality of recognition, of something arriving that he hadn't planned for and had stopped trying to resist. "Do you want to go back?" he asked, quiet, direct, asking her specifically, with her specific answer as the only operative fact in the room. The word no arrived before she'd finished hearing the question. "No," she said. He held her gaze for 1 moment longer. Then he looked at Veth. "You have your answer," he said. "Leave." Veth's careful mouth thinned. He looked at his 2 companions. Something moved in his expression that was beyond displeasure. Something that was carrying a message backward to whoever had sent him. A preliminary calculation of consequence. "His Majesty will view this as a hostile. His Majesty," Kael said, "can view it however he chooses." The envoy left. The 3 of them stood in the entrance hall as the sound of hooves retreated across the cobblestones, and the silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any that had preceded it. Heavier, shaped, containing the outline of something that had been set in motion and would not now be stopped. Zara was aware that her hands were shaking. She was aware that she had just been claimed, openly, formally, in front of Vaelthorn's own representative, by two men who didn't know what they were claiming, who didn't know what she carried, who had placed themselves between her and the man who had threatened to destroy her, with a completeness and a certainty that no one in 3 years of court life had ever. Silas turned to her, looked at her face. His gold eyes moved over it the way they did when he was reading something complex. Careful, thorough, not missing the shaking hands. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the pleasantness was gone entirely, and what was there was simply him, direct and real and paying attention. She opened her mouth, and Kael's hand came to rest between her shoulder blades, just that. Just his hand, warm and large and unhurried, not a gesture that demanded anything. Just there, just steady. She closed her mouth, swallowed what she'd been about to say. "I have to tell them." The thought was louder now than it had ever been. "I have to tell them, and it might end this. And I don't know if I can survive what this ending would feel like." That last part was the most frightening thing she had allowed herself to think in 8 days. She breathed through it. "I'm all right," she said. Neither of them said anything, but neither of them moved away. Outside, Vaelthorn's horses disappeared into the tree line, carrying their message home. The war had a start date now, whether any of them had agreed to it or not. It happened on the 10th day. The morning had started the way most mornings started now. Zara, waking before dawn in the gray pre-light, sitting at the edge of her bed with her hand pressed flat against her still flat stomach, breathing through the nausea in long measured counts until it receded to something manageable. The moon-lilies on her windowsill had closed 3 days ago and not yet reopened, and the absence of their light had made the room feel different in a way she hadn't anticipated, which told her something about herself she wasn't prepared to examine. She'd drunk Marin's tea, eaten half of what she should have, come down to the training yard because Silas had been waiting in it every morning for 10 days, and she had stopped pretending she wasn't going there on purpose. The session had been good initially. Better than good. She had been improving, genuinely and measurably, which was the kind of concrete progress that gave her something to think about, that wasn't the growing weight of what she was keeping from them. Her footwork was cleaner. She was learning to read the shift in Silas's weight that telegraphed his next move. She had twice this week actually surprised him, and the expression on his face both times, genuine, unguarded delight, the almost smile becoming something fuller and more real, had lodged itself somewhere in her chest and refused to leave. Kael had begun appearing at the yard's edge in the last few sessions, not participating, just present, one shoulder against the wall, arms crossed, watching with the concentrated attention he applied to everything. He never commented on the sessions directly. He had twice appeared at her door afterward with things she needed before she'd known she needed them: a better grip wrap for her palm, a liniment for the muscle she'd pulled in her left shoulder. He left them without announcement, and she accepted them without making it a conversation, and it was, she had decided, its own kind of language. She was in the middle of the defensive sequence, the third form, the one that required her to drop her center of gravity and pivot on her back foot, when the world came apart. It was not the gentle tilting of the previous fainting spell. This was categorical and complete, a sudden, absolute withdrawal of the ground from beneath her, her vision going not gray but white, a roaring sound in her ears that erased everything else. She had exactly half a second of awareness that she was falling before she stopped being aware of anything. Kael was across the yard. He moved the way she had seen him move only once before, at the cliff, when he'd stepped out of the mist, the speed of something that did not have to think about physics, because it had made its arrangements with physics long ago. He crossed 30 feet of packed earth in the time it took her to drop 2 feet, and he caught her with both arms, one behind her back and one beneath her knees, absorbing her full weight without any of the bracing adjustment a human would have required. He knelt on the ground with her, which brought her horizontal, which was where she needed to be. His face was very close. He was saying her name. She surfaced to the sound of it. Zara, Zara. and the flatness was completely gone from his voice for the first time she could remember, replaced with something raw and unfiltered that she was too disoriented to fully catalog. "I'm here," she said, which came out barely audible. "Don't move." His hands on her were absolutely steady, the steadiness of someone who is converting panic into function. "Silas." "Here." Silas was already on his other side, close, one hand going immediately to her face, checking her temperature, the pulse at her jaw, the rapid, efficient assessment of someone checking a system for damage. His gold eyes were dark and very serious. "What happened?" She collapsed. Kael's voice, still stripped of its usual containment, still carrying that exposed quality. "I'm fine," Zara said. Her voice was stronger this time. She moved to sit up. Kael's arm tightened fractionally, not restricting, just present, like a wall that has decided to stay put until it's certain the weather has passed. And then she felt it. The moment when everything changed. His face was close to her, closer than it had been in any of the careful distances they'd maintained across 10 days of sitting rooms and training yards and meals conducted with the particular formality of two people managing an enormous amount of unspoken things. His face was close, and she felt the moment his hybrid instincts went to work, the way they always did when she was within his range. That automatic sensory cataloging that was simply how he moved through the world. And this time, there was nothing to interrupt it. No alarm, no conversation, no diplomatic emergency arriving to pull focus. He heard it. She watched it happen, watched the recognition arrive in his gold eyes, confusion first, the same way it had arrived in Silas's face by the fireplace. The unfamiliar rhythm, the second-time signature underneath the first. But Kael was not Silas. He processed differently, deeper and more methodically, and he didn't stop at confusion. She watched him move through it, watched the categorization begin, watched him reach for what it meant with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything, and she watched the moment he arrived at the answer. His eyes came to her face. For a long, suspended moment, one of those moments that contain a very large amount of time in a very small space, they simply looked at each other. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not the silences she'd grown used to from Kael. Those were chosen, calibrated, comfortable in their own austere way. This one was structural. It held the shape of something that had just been fundamentally reorganized. He set her on her feet with the same careful steadiness, and then he stood, and he took a single step back, and the distance of that step, one step, only one, landed on her like a closing door. Silas looked between them. She watched him read the room, the thing he was best at, reading rooms, reading people, reading the space between them for what wasn't being said. She watched his expression change as the information assembled itself, and she watched the almost smile not come, and that absence was its own kind of verdict. "How long?" he asked. She knew what he was asking. She wasn't going to insult any of them by pretending otherwise. 10 weeks, she said. Approximately. Another silence. "Alaric," Kael said, not a question. The word arrived flat and final, a stone dropped into still water. "Yes." Kael turned away from her, walked to the far end of the training yard, and stood with his back to her, both hands braced against the outer wall, and said nothing. His shoulders were rigid. The scar on his jaw, in profile, was very white against the tension of his face. Silas stayed where he was. He was looking at her with the gold eyes that had, in 10 days, become something she instinctively searched for when she entered a room. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said very quietly, "You've been carrying this the whole time?" "Yes." "The fainting, the mornings." A pause. All of it." "Yes." He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're filing information they'd rather not have. He looked at the ground briefly, then back at her. "Why didn't you tell us?" She had prepared for anger. She had braced for it across 10 days, rehearsed responses to it, built defensive positions around the truth the way you build a wall around something you expect to be attacked. She had not prepared for "why didn't you tell us?" asked in that voice. Quiet, earnest, carrying in it the specific pain of someone who had offered something real and been kept at arm's length from it. "Because," she started. "Because you thought we'd send you back," Kael said, still facing the wall. His voice had returned to its usual flatness, but the flatness was doing different work now, covering something rather than expressing something. "Because I thought you'd see me differently." The honesty arrived before she could curate it. "Because for 10 days you looked at me like I was—" She stopped, "like I was something worth looking at, and I didn't want to watch that change." The training yard held the quiet. Kael pushed off the wall, turned around. His face was the closed-door face, fully deployed, and she had learned enough of him to know that it was deployed hardest when what was behind it was the most difficult to contain. "The child is Alaric Vaelthorn's," he said, as if saying it plainly was the first step of dealing with it plainly. "Yes. And you knew this when you came into our fortress?" "Yes." He looked at her. She held it. She did not apologize. Not because she didn't feel the weight of the withheld truth, but because apologizing felt like flinching, when she was done flinching. "I need—" he started, and then stopped, which was the most alarming thing she had seen from him. Kael did not start sentences and stop them. Kael finished every sentence he began. "I need time," he said finally. He left the training yard. Silas stood alone with her in the packed earth space and looked at where his brother had been. "Give him tonight," he said. Not as comfort, as logistics, as the accurate assessment of the timeline required. "And you?" she asked. He looked at her. The gold eyes, stripped of the light quality they usually carried, were still there. Still seeing her, still holding the particular attentive quality that had, she realized, become something she unconsciously relied on to feel like herself. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. He left too, but slowly, and he looked back once. The night that followed was the loneliest Zara had spent since the rain outside the great hall. She sat in her room with the closed moon-lilies on the windowsill and felt the absence of their voices, both of their voices, in the fortress with a precision she hadn't anticipated. She had told herself for 10 days that she was managing this, that she was keeping appropriate boundaries, that she was not building anything on the warmth they had given her, was not allowing herself to need it, was not letting the gold of their eyes and the steady heat of their presence become something she couldn't function without. She pressed her hands against her stomach. She thought about a child who had no idea yet what world it had been conceived into, a child who had done nothing wrong, a child who deserved someone who would fight for it. Woke to sound. Not the fortress alarm woke to sound. Not the fortress alarm this time. Something worse, something immediate and interior. The crash of stone, a concussive impact that shook the eastern wall and sent a fine cascade of dust from the ceiling of her room. Then shouts. Then the particular silence of a building that has just registered violence and is deciding how to respond. Then Marin's voice at her door. "Get up, now!" The Vaelthorn soldiers came over the eastern wall, 40 of them in the black infiltration armor that Alaric's special forces wore, vampire fast and organized with the efficiency of a force that had been planning this for days. They came without torches and operating in near-total darkness, moving through the fortress interior with the confidence of people who had been given floor plans. Zara knew this because Silas told her in 12 words flat as he found her in the corridor outside her room. 40, eastern entry, they had plans. Don't stop moving. And then he was gone, a blade in each hand, moving toward the sound of the fighting with the same fluid economy she'd watched him practice every morning in the training yard. Marin pulled her in the opposite direction. "The nursery wing," Marin said tightly. Zara stopped moving. "There is no nursery." "There will be." Marin's gray eyes were fierce and absolutely clear. "And that's where they're going." The cold that hit Zara then had nothing to do with the stone floor beneath her bare feet. He doesn't want the baby. And the thought arrived with the particular horror of understanding something you'd almost hoped wasn't true. He never wanted any evidence. He doesn't want to bring it back. He wants to destroy it. She ran. Kael was already there. The nursery wing was on the fortress's eastern side, 3 rooms that had been, in whatever previous life this fortress had served, intended for exactly this purpose. She had never gone in them. She hadn't been able to. She came around the corner of the corridor to find 4 of Alaric's soldiers down on the floor, and Kael standing in the doorway of the first room with a blade in his hand and blood on his sleeve that was not his own, and 2 more soldiers in the corridor finding this out about themselves in real time. She had watched Silas fight in the training yard every morning. She thought she'd understood something about what the Vael kings were physically capable of. She had not. Kael fought the way tectonic plates move, with an inevitability that made the word fought feel imprecise. There was no wasted motion, no performance. Each action connected to the next with the logical efficiency of someone solving an equation rather than surviving an attack. The 2 soldiers lasted less time than it took her to register what she was watching, and then they didn't, and Kael turned, breathing hard but controlled, and saw her in the corridor. Something crossed his face. She had, in 10 days, learned to read the small expressions that moved through the fortress of his face before the gates closed. She had learned the micro-expression of assessing, and the different one of approving, and the rarest one, only twice. And both times before the revelation in the training yard that she had privately and hopelessly categorized as wanting. What was on his face now was none of those. What was on his face was relief. "You need to get back," he started. "They came for this wing specifically," she said. "They were given a floor plan, Kael. He's not here to retrieve me. He's here to—" "I know." His voice was tight. "I know what he's here for." More sounds from the eastern end of the corridor. He turned toward them and then turned back, and the conflict on his face, the thing that pulled between the fighting and the staying, was visible in a way she had never seen conflict be visible on him before. "Go to Maren," he said. "Stay in the interior rooms. Don't— Kael." He stopped. "I know you need time," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided, somewhere in the space between waking and running, that if this night was what it appeared to be, she was done performing composure she didn't feel. "I know what I didn't tell you, and I know what it cost, and I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight, but I need you to know," her voice held, barely, "that this baby has nothing that was chosen. It didn't choose its father. It didn't choose any of this. And I will understand after tonight if you decide this isn't something you can—" "Zara." His voice stopped her. He crossed the corridor in 2 steps and his hands came to her face, both of them, large and warm and careful, his thumbs at her cheekbones, tilting her face up in the way of someone who needs to look at something directly before they can speak truly about it. His gold eyes were close. The scar at his jaw moved with the set of his teeth. "I am going to finish clearing this corridor," he said, each word placed with absolute precision. "And when it's done, I'm going to find you, and we're going to have the rest of this conversation." His thumbs moved fractionally, the smallest, most involuntary gesture. "But I need you to understand something right now, while I still have time to say it clearly." A pause. The child didn't choose its father, but it chose a mother who ran barefoot through the forbidden woods rather than give it up. Something shifted in his expression, deep and tectonic, moving from somewhere below the controlled surface. "That matters to me." He let go. He turned back to the corridor. She stood in the half-dark and felt something inside her chest crack open along a seam she'd spent 10 days pretending wasn't there. Silas found her 20 minutes later. The raid was over by then. 37 of the 40 soldiers down, the remaining 3 having made the intelligent decision to retreat before Silas reached them. She knew this because she could hear the quality of the silence that followed, the specific quiet of a building that has finished deciding how to respond to violence and has arrived at an answer. He came to her in the corridor outside the nursery wing. He had a cut on his forearm and blood on his collar, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen on the cliff. All pretense stripped away, the real thing underneath standing in the open without apology. He stopped in front of her. "The bond," he said. "Not preamble. The pull we feel toward you, we thought it was a true mate bond blooming. Kael and I both felt it from the first night." She met his eyes. "We may have been wrong about what it is," he continued, "what it came from, but I need you to understand something." He looked at her with the absolute attention she had come to rely on like a compass bearing. "It doesn't change. Whatever the origin, it doesn't change. Not for me." She thought about Alaric, about the bond she had believed in, the one she had built her life around, the warmth she had confused for something permanent. She felt it now, not as love, not anymore, as a tether, a leftover architectural element from a building that had been demolished. She felt it the way you feel a cast after the bone has healed, as something that had served its purpose and was now only weight. She made a decision. She didn't announce it, didn't perform it. It was too internal for performance, a turning away, a deliberate diversion of current from a dead circuit. She felt it happen in her chest, the severing of the thing Alaric had called a bond. The thing she understood now had been primarily gravitational, mass and proximity masquerading as destiny. She let it go, and what was left, in the space where it had been, was quieter and warmer and more specific. It did not have the manufactured grandeur of what she'd felt in Vaelthorn's candle-lit halls. It felt instead like pine and cedar and fire, like a hand steady at her back in the entrance hall, like the word there said without condescension, like boots left outside a door without a note, because some things don't require annotation. "I know," she said to Silas. He searched her face, found whatever he was looking for. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a declaration, the way you take the hand of someone who has just been through something, and it matters that they're not alone in it. She didn't let go. From the eastern corridor came the sound of Kael's footsteps, measured and deliberate, the particular cadence she had memorized without meaning to, coming back, as promised, finding her, as promised. The fortress settled around them into its damaged, imperfect, standing quiet. Outside, the forbidden woods held the dark, and somewhere in the retreating distance, Alaric Vaelthorn's surviving soldiers carried news home that would change the shape of what was coming, news of a fortress that had held, and 2 kings who had fought for what was theirs, and a woman who had made her choice in the middle of the wreckage and not looked back. The eclipse began at dusk. It moved across the face of the full moon the way certainty moves across a decision, slowly at first, then with an inevitability that made watching it feel less like astronomy and more like prophecy. The sky above the forbidden woods turned from deep blue to something darker, something that had no clean name, and the light that fell across the fortress walls went from silver to amber to the particular blood red of a total lunar eclipse, painting everything it touched in shades that looked borrowed from a different world entirely. Zara stood on the fortress battlements and watched it happen. Behind her, the war was assembling. She could hear it, the organized sounds of a fighting force preparing, the low cadence of commands passed down lines, the metal language of weapons being checked and armor being fastened, the particular quality of collective human and hybrid breath when it understands what the next few hours will ask of it. The Vael border forces had been mobilizing since dawn. Scouts had reported Alaric's army at 12 miles and closing, not the infiltration force of the raid, not 40 soldiers in black armor moving quietly through the dark. This was the full instrument of Vaelthorn's military power: 300 vampires, 60 wolves, and the ancient compulsion magic that Alaric wielded the way some rulers wielded money as the primary currency of his authority. He was not coming for negotiation. He was coming because 2 kings had stood in front of his envoy and used the word ours, and because 40 of his best soldiers had not come home. And because Alaric Vaelthorn had survived 3 centuries by ensuring that every person who had ever publicly diminished him had been made to regret it comprehensively, he was coming because of her. Zara pressed both hands against the battlements and felt the cold of the stone beneath her palms and breathed the pine and rain air of the forbidden woods and made herself be still for 1 more minute before everything changed. She was 4 months along now. The evidence of it was beginning to be visible, a gentle rounding that she had stopped trying to conceal beneath loose clothing, a physical fact that had, since the night of the raid, stopped being a secret and started being simply a truth that the 3 of them moved around and through and increasingly, carefully toward. Kael had placed his hand against her stomach 3 days ago, not asking, not dramatic, simply there one morning at the breakfast table, his large, warm palm resting against the curve of her for a moment while he read the morning reports. She had not moved. He had not commented. The moment had lasted approximately 10 seconds and had rearranged something in the architecture of her understanding of what they were to each other. Silas had been reading books. She'd found them in the sitting room, stacked with characteristic Silas organization on the table beside his chair, texts on hybrid children, on the physiology of cross-species births, on the particular developmental markers of children born of mixed supernatural lines. He'd looked up when she found them. "I need to know things," he'd said simply. The to know things," he'd said simply. "We." The word had arrived in her chest and stayed. She turned from the battlements now and looked at the red-stained sky and understood, with a clarity that had no drama in it, that she was done being something that had happened to other people's stories. She was done being the palate cleanser, the complication, the variable that arrived uninvited and disrupted established arrangements. She was the arrangement now. She went downstairs to find her kings. They came at midnight. Alaric's army crossed the border into Vael territory with the particular arrogance of a force that has never seriously imagined losing. They came with torches, hundreds of them, so turning the tree line to a moving constellation of cold fire, and they came with the vampire battle call that had broken defensive lines across 3 kingdoms, a sound below human hearing that operated directly on the nervous system, designed to produce the particular paralysis of absolute dread. The Vael forces held the line. The battle that followed was not the kind that gets clean treatment in history. It was not lines of soldiers meeting in an open field with the courtesy of declared positions. It was the kind that happens in dense terrain, in the dark, between forces that do not share the same physics. It moved through the forbidden woods like weather, fragmenting into 100 smaller engagements, each one complete and brutal and its own miniature world of consequence. Zara fought at the line. She had not planned to. Silas had not planned for her to. She had seen it in his face at the pre-battle briefing. The tension between his understanding that she was a capable fighter and the older, more instinctive thing that wanted her behind walls. He hadn't said it. She respected him for not saying it. She had simply taken her position in the line and met his eyes until he accepted the fact of her. She fought well, better than she had any right to, for someone who had been learning for 11 weeks. The borderland form translated in actual combat from an abstract sequence into something that made visceral sense. The low center of gravity, the use of terrain, the economy that conserved energy across an engagement that might last hours rather than minutes. She fought well until the vampire reached her from the left, faster than the scouts had assessed their frontline speed, faster than her training accounted for, and hit her with enough force to send her skidding across the pine needle floor of the woods, her blade spinning away into the dark, the impact driving the breath from her body and replacing it with a white-edged pain that radiated through her left side. She lay on the forest floor. The red eclipse light came through the canopy in fragments. The vampire stood over her, and then something happened that she had no framework for. Something that began in the center of her chest, not with pain, but with heat. A warmth that started internal and moved outward through her blood like a tide moving in, like a decision being made at the cellular level, like her body finally encountering the specific conditions under which it was willing to reveal what it had always been. Her hybrid form emerged not with violence but with certainty. It was not the transformation she had read about in the Vaelthorn court records, the torn clothing and the agonized contortion of something fighting its own nature. It was instead like an exhale, like something long held finally being set down. The white came from everywhere at once, her skin to fur, her spine extending, her hands reshaping into something that was neither human hand nor animal paw, but something that combined the dexterity of the first with the capability of the second. Wings, white, enormous, built of the same impossible architecture as the moon-lilies on her windowsill, luminescent in the eclipse-red dark, spread from her shoulders with the unhurried confidence of something that had always been there, waiting for the appropriate occasion. The vampire took a step back. She stood up. She was not larger than she had been, but she took up more space. Not physically, not exactly. More the way a fire takes up more space than its actual dimensions because of what it radiates outward. The white of her form caught the blood-red eclipse light and held it, converting it to something brighter, and the forbidden woods around her went quiet in the immediate radius with the particular quiet of very old things, recognizing something they had been expecting for a very long time. The vampire turned and ran. She let it go. She had somewhere to be. Alaric was at the center of the battle the way a cold front is at the center of a storm, not fighting, precisely, but organizing the temperature of everything around him. He stood in the clearing where the forbidden woods opened toward the fortress's northern approach, dressed in his formal blacks that somehow remained immaculate amid the surrounding chaos, and he watched his army work with the detached evaluation of a man who has already decided the outcome. She saw him before he saw her. She had time to observe him for a full 10 seconds before his attention moved to her, and in those 10 seconds, she understood something she had spent 8 months being too close to comprehend. He was performing. He had always been performing. The silver eyes and the carved face and the devastating certainty, all of it was architecture. Now for the person. She had built her love on for the person. She had built her love on the stage set rather than the stage. His eyes found her. Something moved in his face. She catalogued it objectively, the way she had learned to catalog things in the past 11 weeks. Surprise first, genuine and unguarded. Then the reassembly of the performance, the silver eyes going cold and precise, the mouth arranging itself into the expression she had once read as authority and now read as its simulation. Then he saw what she was wearing, the white form, the wings, the way the eclipse light moved around her rather than simply falling on her. For the first time in 3 centuries, and Alaric Vaelthorn looked at something with an expression that was not performative. He looked afraid. Zara. Her name in his voice, deployed with the particular intimacy he had always weaponized. The private register, the suggestion of shared history, the tonal architecture of you and I understand each other in ways these others cannot. This isn't what you want. You know that. He took 1 step toward her. You feel it. The bond. Even now, you feel it. She did feel it. She had expected not to, had expected the severing she'd performed in the corridor after the raid to be clean and final. But it was there, a tug, low and persistent, the gravitational remnant of 8 months of believing in something. It pulled toward him with the dumb insistence of a habit the body hasn't been told to stop. She felt it. She also felt, and arriving from either side with the warm certainty of something that had chosen her rather than claimed her, the presence of the 2 people who had been moving through the battle toward this moment since it began. Kael arrived on her left. Silas arrived on her right. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Their presence alone, the specific warmth of them, the particular quality of attention they carried when she was at the center of it, arrived like a current, like something flowing through her from both sides and meeting in the middle, and where it met it did something to the gravitational pull of Alaric's bond. Not fighting it, not suppressing it, simply outweighing it, the way the sun outweighs the moon's pull, not in opposition but in magnitude. She felt the bond try. She felt it fail. No, she said, simple, final. no a door closing from the inside. Alaric's jaw tightened. The performance cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, but she saw it, and so did the Vaelthorn court members who had positioned themselves at the clearing's edge, watching their king face what he had sent an army to destroy. She registered them with peripheral awareness, 20, 30 of them, the senior lords and ladies and chancellors who had laughed in that great hall 12 weeks ago, who had watched him name her a palate cleanser and elevated their goblets in toast. They were not laughing now. "You are carrying my child," he said, and the privacy of it, the attempt to make it an intimate fact rather than a political one, was the last maneuver available to him. "I'm carrying a child," she said. "That child belongs to itself." Kael moved. He covered the distance between himself and Alaric with the same tectonic inevitability she'd watched in the fortress corridor during the raid, and Alaric, who had not lived 3 centuries by being slow, met it with the compulsion strike that was his most lethal weapon, the direct neural assault that had dropped opponents before they'd finished drawing breath. It met Kael's hybrid resistance and scattered. Kael hit him with a force that wasn't about anger. It was too precise for anger, too intentional. It was about consequence. It was about the specific delivery of a reckoning that had been building since a woman had run barefoot out of a great hall in the rain. Silas flanked in the same moment from the right, not with Kael's direct force, but with the strategic disruption she'd watched him employ in training, finding the gaps, redirecting the momentum, ensuring that every direction Alaric moved was the wrong one. They fought the way they did everything, as complements, as a system, 2 people who had spent long enough together that they operated as a single extended intelligence. It was not a long fight. 3 centuries of survival, and Alaric Vaelthorn had never faced opponents who were not also afraid of him. He had built his kingdom on that fear, had maintained it, had wielded it so consistently that he had perhaps genuinely forgotten what it felt like to stand across from something that simply wasn't. Kael and Silas were not afraid of him. They had never been afraid of him. They had studied him the way you study weather, tracking, preparing. Went down in the eclipse-red light of the Forbidden Woods, in front of his court, with none of the dignity that 3 centuries of careful performance had constructed. The court watched. That was the part that mattered most in the end. Vaelthorn's senior lords and ladies and chancellors, who had built their positions on the certainty of Alaric's invulnerability, stood at the clearing's edge and watched him lose. Not just physically. They had seen him injured before, had seen him recover from things that would have ended lesser beings. What they had never seen was this: Alaric Vaelthorn afraid. Alaric Vaelthorn, in the moment before Kael reached him, looking at a woman he had named a palate cleanser, and seeing in her face something he couldn't manage or maneuver or perform his way around. Chancellor Veth, who had small eyes and a careful mouth, and had spent 30 years making himself useful to dangerous people, looked at the clearing and made the calculation that careful people make when the landscape changes decisively. He looked at the 2 vile kings standing over his fallen monarch. He looked at the woman between them, white-formed, eclipse-lit, unmistakably something other than what she had been when she stood in Vaelthorn's great hall holding a ruined gown. He knelt. It was not a planned gesture. It had the quality of something the body does when the mind has run the numbers and reached a conclusion faster than decorum can curate it. But once he had done it, on the court shifted, the slow, irresistible movement of a tide that has found its direction, and one by one, in the red light of the lunar eclipse, the court of Vaelthorn acknowledged the thing that had happened in this clearing tonight. Alaric, on the ground, looked at his kneeling court and understood what kind of defeat this was. Not just a battle, not just a loss to be recovered from with time and strategy and the careful application of fear. This was the kind of defeat that 3 centuries of performance couldn't survive, the kind that happens when the audience finally sees the mechanism behind the curtain. He closed his silver eyes. 6 months later. The child arrived on a morning with no rain. This felt significant. The Forbidden Woods had been caught in an almost continuous rainfall since the eclipse. Not storm, not disaster, just the persistent, contemplative rain of a landscape processing something large. It had been raining when Zara had first run through the trees. It had been raining when she'd stood at the cliff edge. It had been raining for so much of the time that had passed between that night and this one that the smell of pine and wet earth had become inseparable from everything that had happened, every decision made and truth revealed, and choice taken in the dark. The morning the child was born, the sky was clear. The sun came through the eastern window of the chamber and turned everything gold: the walls, the floor, the white linen, the faces of the two men who had been there since before dawn and showed no inclination to be anywhere else. Maren moved through it all with her unhurried efficiency and her gray eyes that saw too clearly, and she placed the child in Zara's arms with the particular care of someone handling something irreplaceable. The child was quiet, alert, looking at the world with the ancient, assessing attention of something newly arrived and already taking inventory. Gold eyes, the precise, burning, impossible gold of a flame held behind glass. Kael's eyes, exact and unmistakable, in a face that was otherwise its own architecture, establishing itself feature by feature with the unhurried confidence of something that had decided what it was going to be. Kael's eyes, Silas said. He was sitting on the edge of the chair closest to the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his gold eyes on the child with an expression she had never seen on him before, open in a way that had no defense in it, no wit, no managed presentation. Simply moved. Kael stood at the window. He had not sat down since the night before. He turned from the sky and looked at the child in her arms, and his face did the thing it had done on the night of the raid. The gates fully open, the closed door expression gone, nothing between what he felt and the air of the room. He crossed to the bed. He sat beside her, close, his warmth immediate and familiar, and looked at the child with the systematic thoroughness he applied to everything that mattered to him. The child looked back. The twin pairs of gold eyes regarded each other with mutual gravity. "Alaric's child?" Kael said. Quiet. A fact, stated plainly, carrying neither weight nor wound. "Our child," Zara said, equally quiet, equally plain. He looked at her. The scar at his jaw moved with the set of his expression, something that had, and over the past months, stopped trying not to be what it was and simply become it. Whatever it was, this thing between the three of them that had no clean name in any language she had learned. He nodded once. Silas reached out and touched the child's hand. One finger, the child's whole hand closing around it with the instinctive, absolute trust of something that has not yet learned to be afraid of anything. He laughed, soft and involuntary, the realest sound she had ever heard from him. "Kael's eyes," he said again. "But look at that grip." He looked up at them both, the gold of his eyes bright. "That's mine." The balcony looked east. They found their way there in the early evening. Not planned, not coordinated, simply the three of them drifting toward the same point the way things drift toward what they belong to. The air was cool and pine-sharp and clean in the way that only exists after long rain has finally stopped, and the forbidden woods spread below them in every direction, ancient and enormous, and theirs. Zara stood at the railing with the child against her chest. The small warm weight of him settled into the particular angle he had already claimed as his preferred position, facing outward with his gold eyes open to the world, and his small face carrying an expression of comprehensive, unimpressed evaluation. Kael stood at her left. Silas stood at her right. The sun was going. The sky in the west had gone amber and rose, and the deep, particular blue of dusk's first arrival, and it turned the tree line below them to something that looked like a painting of itself. The fortress walls caught the last of the light and held it for a moment before letting it go. Zara thought about a great hall full of laughter at her expense. She thought about rain and cobblestones and a pregnancy test held in shaking hands. She thought about a cliff edge and two figures emerging from the mist, and the feeling, irrational and uninvited and absolutely correct, that she had arrived somewhere rather than escaped somewhere. She thought about what it meant to be astray, to be a woman who had walked through the wrong door at the wrong moment and found herself with nothing, no title, no protection, no version of the future she had planned. To be named something disposable by someone she had loved with the kind of love that didn't ask for receipts. She looked at the kingdom below her. Not Vaelthorn. She felt no claim to Vaelthorn, wanted no claim to it, left its political reorganization to the lords who had knelt in the clearing and were currently discovering what governance looked like when it wasn't held together with fear. She meant the Forbidden Woods, the fortress, the territory that had been carved out of the world's margins by two men who had decided to be unreachable and had instead become, without planning it, home. She meant this. The three of them on this balcony. The child in her arms who had his father's eyes and his uncle's grip, and who looked at the world with the comprehensive, unbothered attention of someone who has no idea yet how extraordinary his arrival was, and will likely be insufferable about it when he finds out. She meant the way Kael's shoulder was warm against hers, the way Silas had tilted his face toward the last of the sun, with the expression of someone who has decided to enjoy the specific moment he's in, rather than the one he's planning for. She meant the smell of pine and the cooling air, and the way the eclipse red had given way, finally and completely, to the clean silver of a full moon rising over the eastern tree line. "She's going to need a name," Silas said, looking at the moon. A pause. He's going to need a name." "We have time," Kael said. "We have time," Zara agreed. The moon climbed. The Forbidden Woods held their ancient quiet below, and the fortress held its warmth behind them, and the child in her arms opened his gold eyes wider at the sight of the rising moon, and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything else, but that all three of them, independently and simultaneously, understood completely. The kingdom had no clean name yet either. It would find one. They had time. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Hit subscribe. The next chapter drops soon.